Welcome. The Leadership Lesson podcast inspires leadership growth in everyone. We have enthralling conversations with top leaders in order to provide you with life-changing lessons. My name is Caleb Nichols. I'm a speaker, a pastor, and a family man. My hope is to inspire spiritual depth and leadership growth in you. I love to sit down with leaders from a variety of fields, hear their personal stories and leadership experiences. This creates the podcast. Enjoy.
Well, welcome to the Leadership Lessons podcast, everyone. Our guest today is Lyle Shelton, possibly the most hated man on the internet, but we'll talk about that in a minute. He's currently with the Christian Democratic Party in New South Wales, and he's the former managing director of the Australian Christian Lobby, which you might remember him for. Really excited to have a little chat to him. We met years ago when he was involved with the ACL at a pastor's retreat, and I always remember that weekend. It was a great time talking about worldview and politics and Christianity and drinking wine. So welcome, Lyle. It's great to have you with me.
Thanks very much, Caleb. That brings back memories. I'd forgotten about that retreat, but that was a great weekend.
I remember you grabbing out the wine one night, and I thought, this is just great.
Please,
talking about changing the world. And
what goes on retreat stays on retreat, Caleb.
That was a great time. And what you guys did in the ACL with the pastors in that retreat, I don't know how many you did, but it was really beneficial for me. It actually helped start me on a bit of a road towards understanding politics, and probably bigger than that, culture and worldview and those kind of things better. So I do really appreciate it. So it's great to have you here, mate. So I wanted to launch off with just that comment. How do you handle the hate from the internet? You're probably one of the most hated Christian men on the internet, based on the comments I've read on your Facebook and things like that. You've obviously copped a lot of flack over the years for your different roles that you've had, whether that's in politics or with the No campaign around the same-sex marriage plebiscite. How do you handle that? How do you handle the pushback?
Well, I don't know whether I'm the most hated man, Caleb, or perhaps I'm
probably
just
an exaggeration.
Probably the most misunderstood man on the internet, I think. I think that's just terrible misunderstandings that people have. But look, in all seriousness, I think anyone who engages mediums like Twitter and Facebook and puts their head up above the parapet in these so-called culture war debates is going to come in for a bit of criticism. And unfortunately, we've lost the ability as a society to argue well, to disagree well. So the whole keyboard warrior sort of thing kicks in, where people can be anonymous and have little brain explosions and say things about people in a not very measured or nuanced way. And we're probably all guilty of it, myself included. Hopefully not in a hateful or bigoted way at people, but that tends to happen. And it is particularly toxic social media environment. I think we all know that, and we desperately need a reformation of manners on the internet and in our public discourse.
Yes. I mean, do you think social media is really worth it? Like, I often just consider, there's not really much good coming out of it. Is it helping in the culture wars?
That's a really good question. Look, I've decided to stay engaged on Twitter and obviously Facebook. I mean, probably more people engage Facebook. It can be a little less toxic, although people do leave toxic comments on your posts. Twitter's really the bad one. I like to stay there because a lot of journalists are there. I'm amazed at how many high-profile people on the what I would call the radical left of politics actually follow me. I put a post up the other day. I can't even remember what it was about, but before I knew it, Patricia Karvelis from the ABC, host of Radio Drive, based in Melbourne, very prominent left-wing commentator. She piled on. Mike Carlton, I think he's a former editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, certainly a senior writer. He jumped in, and suddenly my contribution on social media had gone viral. I didn't mind that, even though it was a Twitter pile-on. People could see it for what it was, but you're contributing to the debate. And the fact that what you have to say from a Christian, pro-family, pro-marriage perspective evokes that sort of reaction, to me, makes it worth it. Not because I want to stir people up, but because I want them to see that they're courageous voices who are willing to put a counter-cultural perspective into those platforms.
And do you get people contact you maybe privately saying, look, I do really appreciate your opinion, and I'm not comfortable to maybe comment publicly because my friends and family might see it, but do you get that kind of affirmation and feedback, or is it just the pile-ons and the negative? And
look, it's there's a lot of the what you see in the online world is generally fairly negative, but what really encourages me is that often people will come up to me if they see me, sometimes at an airport or at a meeting where you might be speaking, or some or in the street sometimes. They'll come up and say, look, if we follow you on social media and really love what you do. And that always really encourages me, and that keeps me going because, they're the quiet Australians, I suppose. And I know that they're out there as well. So, yeah, it's definitely worth it. And I think it's important that we don't vacate the space. My friend, George Christensen, who's the federal member for Dawson, in Mackay, we've known each other for many, many years. He, a few years ago, famously, decided to get off Twitter. And I said, George, don't. We need to have more voices from the conservative, Christian, centre-right perspective. Don't just vacate the field to the radical left and the libertarian right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And it's a fascinating culture we live in, isn't it? Because the old systems of having a voice or communicating have been disrupted by social media, and it does allow anyone who's got something to say, if it's decent to say, it can potentially rise to the top on the internet, which is very interesting. I think for your average person, being a pastor, it can be challenging for them because you find a YouTuber you like, you find a podcast you like, and all of a sudden everything they say is gospel because it just aligns with what you want to hear. And I think that's going to be the challenge for the next generation, is helping them understand that there'll always be someone who says exactly what you want to hear on the internet, but you still, critical thinking is important, respect is important, proper research is important, facts are important. Yeah. I think those things are still critical.
Well, I think the thing that should encourage those of you who are pastors, Caleb, and look, I'm sure you're a terrific communicator. Well, I know you're a terrific communicator, but as you say, all of us, can compare ourselves with the professional podcasts and productions that people do these days. But what you offer and what our local churches offer, which the internet can't, is authentic community. And I think, you can give people the full package, great communication, but also genuine relationship. And that is the obvious limitation. Despite the advantages of social media and these new platforms, which are wonderful, nothing replaces face-to-face contact and authentic, relationships that are honest and open, and that sort of iron sharpening iron. So I think, it's the local pastor is... I think that your role is more important than ever now.
If you could just come to my church on Sunday and tell everyone that, especially down here in Victoria, man, it's a difficult time. We're recording this podcast as we're just coming out of lockdowns before Christmas 2021, and it's like, man, I don't think people really understand how difficult it's been in Victoria. We have had 50 Sundays without a gathering in person over the last couple of years, and for the church and community and walking together, be authentic, we have been pushed to a cliff edge. So I thank you for saying that, everyone. You heard it here first, that pastors are important. So
absolutely, no, I really mean it. It is so important. Look, I hope and pray that as a result of the trauma that you've all been through in Victoria, and we've had it to a lesser extent here in Sydney, it's been terrible. I hate being alone. I've loved getting back to church in the last couple of weeks, and I think we've got to really lean into those relationships and being in an environment where we are honest and open and accountable to each other. And that only comes through that face-to-face contact. So you won't get that on YouTube.
Nah, so critical. Nah, really well said. So on your website, it talks about you being involved for the last 20 years as a key participant in Australia's culture wars. And your book that you wrote in 2020 called I Kid You Not, the tagline is Notes from 20 Years in the Culture Wars. And yeah, just interested. Why are you so keen to be a participant in the culture wars of Australia?
Yeah, I think since I was very young, I grew up in a pastor's home. My parents were involved in Christian ministry. My dad's a pastor. I think he's perhaps been a guest or is going to be a guest
He
on your
has.
podcast. And we just always had a keen interest in politics and obviously Christianity. And I guess as I was becoming politically aware as a teenager in the 1980s, issues like abortion and what we were doing to the unborn in the womb and how this was being enabled through politics, really concerned me as a young person, and also just the political and cultural trends that were devaluing marriage and the family. So I carried these concerns as a very young man. You could see the breakdown in society, and this wasn't a good trend. The sexual revolution. I mean, I was born at the last year of the 1960s, so that dates me. I know that the boyish good looks I'm projecting on this podcast don't belie that age. But I and yourself, all of us who have lived since that time have grown up in the shadow of the 1960s sexual revolution, and that's permeated our whole existence. And the value systems of our friends and those that we go to uni with, etc., what we see in the media, has all been this anti-family toxicity, and we're reaping the whirlwind in terms of children being brought up without fathers or mothers, predominantly without fathers. The social carnage that's come as a result of that through crime and just general sense of meaninglessness, suicide rates are through the roof for young people in the most prosperous civilizations that have ever lived. I mean, so what we've done in the last 50, 60 years has been terrible, and much of it, not all of it, has been facilitated through politics. Politics and culture sort of play a role together. So I just found myself developing a real passion for that. And I've just pursued that my whole life, and I found myself in roles where I've been confronted with, do I speak up about what I see happening, or do I stay silent? And that book, I guess, came because I realised I'd reached a juncture in my life where, hey, I actually have been full-time in the culture wars for 20 years. And I was at a bit of a juncture in life where I was in between things. I'd had a failed bid at running for the Senate up in my home state of Queensland, had some time on my hands. So I thought I'll just write down things that have been on my heart that I've experienced, burdens about how I see Australian society, the state of the church. I put it all down in that book, and I just called it, I kid you not. Actually, my publisher came up with that title, I kid you not, because he was very kindly allowing me to use some office space in his office in Brisbane. And I think every day when I'd come in and we'd shoot the breeze about the latest travesty in the media, I'd say, this has happened, I kid you not, So my publisher, Anthony Capello, said, the title of your book has to be I Kid You Not, and we subtitled it Notes from 20 Years in the Trenches of the Culture War. So it follows my journey from a youngish Toowoomba City Councillor, my first elected office, through the ACL years, the marriage campaign, and a couple of things that I've done since then.
And what was really formative for you, like maybe it was in your 20s or something that really took you, this is how I'm going to live my life, this is going to be my vocation, maybe you felt was a calling from God? Was there a moment, was there a flashpoint, an issue that in particular got you involved?
I think, these things sort of morph and evolve, I guess. Going back to my childhood, I made a clear decision that I wanted to follow Jesus as a child. Now, I was not a perfect child, as my parents will readily attest. Just because you decide to follow Jesus and be a Christian doesn't make you a goody two-shoes or anything like that.
Not.
But it did become the overarching sort of drive in my life, and my faith grew as I grew older. And my interest in politics grew as well. And I mentioned issues like the human rights for the unborn and the breakdown of marriage and family, and you could see the effect of this through society. So I became engaged and interested in those issues. Also, the churches I was involved in, particularly my dad's church and other churches that were associated with his movement, were probably pioneers in developing a what I'd call theology of Christian political engagement. So we were seeing the gospel as, yes, obviously it is our relationship with Jesus, of course, and our worship of him, and what we as Christians call piety, really important. But also seeing that the scriptures had a lot more to say than just about me as an individual getting to heaven. That the gospel and the Bible is all about how this world is ordered and how justice is administered on the face of the earth, and that God is interested in the poor, in the marginalised, the downtrodden. He's interested in the structures of society which facilitate human flourishing. And any objective look at what's happening in our world, you'll see that those structures are breaking down, traditions, norms, things which have upheld us. And I want to say that carefully. It's not about sort of hearkening back to the past, but as Christians, we want to see human flourishing and make sure that we're following principles, virtues, ethics. Ultimately, following the Lord Jesus is what leads to human flourishing. Now, how that translates into public policy and advocacy, that's all very fraught. But nonetheless, these are the things that I've sought to pursue, very imperfectly, but at least in some way. And I guess the book tells a bit of that story.
And how do you reconcile the fighting with your faith? Because some people, like you're talking there about, how does a Christian approach culture? And obviously there's some kind of theological position in your upbringing, in your belief that allows you and encourages you that the gospel is not just personal, but it actually transcends the person, the church, and ends in the culture. But there's obviously other theological positions that would see that as inappropriate, that it is more private, or should be more of a separation between the sacred and the secular, and So how do you reconcile the fighting bit? Because you got to say some things, you got to speak up, you got to maybe you haven't done them well at times, maybe you haven't represented Christ well at times. I'm sure I haven't. How do you reconcile the two? Because fighting is a strong word, an aggressive word that maybe wouldn't be associated with Christianity.
Yeah, that's right. And I've used the word war in the subtitle of my book. So I'm saying, we're in a culture war. There's a lot that you could unpack in your question. Theologically, the Bible uses military metaphors. Now, we know from the teachings of Christ that Christianity is a non-violent religion. When we can get into what nation states do in terms of wars and just war theory enunciated by Augustine, back in the the 4th or 5th century. So there's long traditions of, justifying military wars. But when we talk about cultural wars, of course, I'm talking metaphorically. And because of the democratic traditions that have developed almost exclusively through Christian influence and perhaps Greco-Roman influence, but more so Christian influence in society, we fight those wars through reasoned discourse and debate, through seeking after truth. So that's what I mean by fighting, and truth does have to be contended for, as my friend and mentor Jim Wallace wrote in the foreword to my book. He said that's the great lesson of history, is that truth has to be contended for. And the Bible is full of that. It says, speak the truth in love. And sometimes the truth, and as you said, I would be the first to say, I perhaps haven't always lived up to that high standard. And sometimes you get it wrong, you get your nuances wrong. But in essence, I think, the role of Christians is to speak truth into society. The church is meant to be the pillar and ground of truth. And we as Christians haven't abandoned the notion that truth exists. Our postmodern society says there is no such thing as truth. Your truth is my truth, and whatever. Let's all kumbaya together. And of course, it doesn't work. It makes a big fat mess. And so the church's role is to help society know the truth. Of course, Jesus says he is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And I believe ultimate truth is found in knowing Christ. But I don't expect everyone to have that revelation. But there are empirical things that we know in the way the world is ordered that we can point our fellow citizens to about the way things work, whether it's the biological reality of marriage. Social science points to Christian family as being the best for human flourishing. There's lots of incontrovertible evidence out there, and we need to be people who speak that. And if you don't speak it, you leave a vacuum. And my great concern is the church has left a big vacuum, particularly in our generation, and others have filled it with lies, and we're now reaping the whirlwind. So this is why I'm passionate about these things.
That's great. I really appreciate the answer, and I've always appreciated men and women like yourself who are willing to step into the culture and have that Christian voice, because not everyone's gig. It's not my first responsibility as a pastor, but you do need people in the body of Christ that play these roles. And then I think we could all play a role to a degree with our democratic freedoms that we have and opportunities we have. And I'm interested, maybe as we finish this little bit, it's been quite a unique wrestle here in Victoria, and you've probably had a bit similar in Sydney, with people and their faith, and then positioning that with the vaccination debate. It's been really, really difficult. So like every church, we have maybe 10% in our church that aren't vaccinated. And it's been interesting trying to work with those guys. But then there's also been ones in our church that are vaccinated, who have other serious mental health things going on, or physical health issues, and they can come back to church, but they don't want to because of anxiety problems or whatever. It's been a really interesting time, it's something we've never lived through before. But I'm interested, maybe, where do you see it, or what do you think with the whole vaccination lockdown mandates from a political point of view, and where we sit as Christians? Because it's not as clear cut, I wouldn't say, as an abortion issue,
Yeah, no, that's right. Look, I think the COVID issue has been one of the most diabolical, confusing, difficult issues we've faced. Look, I think obviously it's a real health issue, particularly for the elderly, for people with comorbidities. And I think earlier on in the pandemic, when we didn't really quite know what we were dealing with, I supported that governments had to take some fairly extreme health measures, and that's fine. They were feeling their way a bit, but then I felt like as we got into this year, it was way too much of an overreaction. I think once we knew a bit more about what we were dealing with, we knew that it predominantly affected the elderly, the vulnerable. I think the effort should have gone into quarantining those people, protecting them, throw the enormous resources that we have spent. We've mortgaged our children's future in hundreds of millions of dollars of debt to get our government debt nudging $1 trillion. I mean, it's unheard of in Australia's history, all in what I think has been a massive overreaction. In terms of the vaccine, look, I've supported the vaccination process, and have got vaccinated myself. I know lots of people who won't touch it, and I respect most of them. Some come at it from what I would consider to be conspiracy theory. Bill Gates is going to be tracking you. You're going to drop dead in 2 years' time if you've had the vaccine. I mean, there are serious people who actually believe stuff like this, and I've heard worse. There are some who I think understandably are hesitant. There was an experimental nature of the vaccine. I was prepared to take that risk, though, because a certain amount of testing had been done, and governments were faced with an emergency. This pandemic was an emergency, and how do we get whole societies out of it? So the vaccine, I think, was the best way to do that. I think there's arguments about whether you vaccinate children and even certain young people. I think we should not dismiss adverse reactions that a small number of people have had, but there have been a significant number of people. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is it does have to be a nuanced sort of debate. But what's happened is, if people like me who have had the vaccine, we're seen as virtuous, and people who might be hesitant or worried about myocarditis or whatever, they're seen as anti-vaxxers. People who are worried about the freedoms because of lockdowns are now derided as far right extremists. So, the sort of polarizing language and the and the inability to hear one another well, I think, has been disappointing. I think governments were within their rights to encourage people to be vaccinated, but I think coercing and mandating it is wrong. I felt and this is my view, and I don't want to sound like I'm more virtuous than others by saying this, but my decision-making process was that, okay, I knew there were risks with taking a vaccine. I knew that it wasn't a perfect vaccine. I knew that I'd probably never die from COVID, but I wanted to be a good citizen. I wanted to play my part in helping my fellow citizens come out of this pandemic. And our government was encouraging us that, based on their best health advice, this was the way for us to come out of lockdowns and to get our society moving again. So I decided to do that, and I think people should be encouraged to do that. But I think we've also got to respect the conscience of those who, for whatever reason, even if they might be for mad conspiracy reasons or whether it's legitimate hesitancy about a process they're not sure about, that needs to be respected as well. And I don't like the crushing of those people. So, that's a bit rambly, but hopefully.
No, well said. I think it's really balanced view, and I would agree. I think there was a level of encouragement that was good, and I think most people like yourself, are saying, took the vaccine and had rational reasons. But I think this grey area, especially in Victoria, where we've got to 80% and then they want 90%, which we're going to hit, which is, I've been saying to people, is miraculous. Yeah. But now it's still not letting up. There's still talk of, Daniel Andrews saying a whole year for people that aren't vaccinated. It's just, I think it has got crazy overreach. It's not good for anyone's mental health. It's not really going to change the game, getting to 91 or 92%. I think it's unhelpful now. And the world isn't perfect. We need to move on and try and just deal with things.
Well, that's the other really big problem that's emerged out of this pandemic, the way governments have handled it and the way they've changed the goalposts all the time and the inconsistent health advice. Now, I get it was a confusing new virus, but I think we have seen clear evidence of health bureaucrats and politicians, particularly Dan Andrews in Victoria, just being drunk on power and making ridiculous rules that make no sense. And, of course, him wanting to hang on to those powers, going with seemingly no end in sight. And so it's made people very cynical of government and sadly, rightly so, at a time when we desperately need to restore trust in our political class, because otherwise our society can't function. A democratic society can't function without trust between those who govern and those who are governed. And that's been, further damaged very badly through the handling of all the state premiers, even the better ones like here in New South Wales. The inconsistencies, the changing goalposts have been terrible.
Would you say it's at a bit of a low, the trust in government at the moment?
Absolutely, and it was coming off a very low base. I think we've seen a toxic eating away of citizens' trust in government for a long time, and politicians are not respected. It's well known they don't keep their word, and the way power has been exercised through this, I think, has damaged that trust, and I think a lot more has got to be done to restore that.
It's an interesting season ahead, mate. I think of my kids, they're 10 to 0 or under 1, and it's going to be interesting for that next generation, your Gen Zers, and then my kids, that democracy, governments, culture, the internet, social media, just the pace of life, it's going to be a very unique environment that they're growing up in or being adults in. So I think, man, I'm just glad that I know Jesus, because I don't think there's anything better you could equip people with at this time than to have a faith in a God who lives, is transcendent to all of this mess, because it's very confusing down here on the earth. So can we move on? I'd love to hear a bit about the same-sex marriage campaign now, just maybe as a reflection. It was in 2017. You led the No campaign, essentially, within the Australian Christian lobby, I think, at that time. I was a little bit involved in my bits and pieces I did down here. What are your reflections on that? What lessons did you learn from that season? it was a big one. It was a big issue. You know, it affected most Australians were involved. So.
Yeah, look, it was a massive issue, and look, I found myself in a position where I ended up being probably the main spokesman, certainly one of the main spokespeople for the No campaign, and really that was because we couldn't find anyone else. we begged some other prominent people when we knew the government was offering a plebiscite. It was going to be a 3-month campaign. We felt we needed someone who was well known and had some gravitas, an elder statesman or stateswoman, but we couldn't get anyone. And I was head of ACL at the time. And,
why is that?
Look, you'd have to look. I need to be careful, but I think people were concerned about jumping into such a toxic debate. I think they could see that it was probably a losing debate. It was seen if you went against what was a very strong cultural trend, backed by a very biased media, that it was akin to, charging at machine guns, and not many people wanted to do that. And they're probably right in doing that. But I guess I'd been at ACL for, almost 10 years, and we had, seen the warning signs of this very early. My predecessor there, Jim Wallace, who remains the chairman of the board at ACL, great man. He, with great foresight, could see, that this was coming down the road. And of course, we would, from when I joined ACL in 2007, we could see this was a major, major threat. Now, it wasn't the only thing we did over those 10 years, but we did have a firm eye on it, and we were trying to awaken the church. We were trying to awaken politicians, and very few would listen. And then at sort of 5 minutes to midnight, when the pressure built after some big international developments, one was the Irish referendum. The global gay lobby were very clever. They picked a tiny little country like Ireland, where the church was weak because of child sex abuse scandals, which had just completely destroyed the credibility of the Catholic Church and a very strong pro-family culture. So they won a referendum there, leveraged the global publicity off that. Then, of course, the US Supreme Court dictated, from the bench, that the whole 52 states of the United States would have gay marriage. So those two things coalescing just built the pressure in Australia, and our media got behind it. It was just relentless. And so, in essence, ACL was sort of really one of the only groups, or one of just a handful of groups, that was saying anything publicly in the lead up to this. And so when it came time to, form a coalition to fight the plebiscite at 5 minutes to midnight, I found myself, I found myself as part of a wonderful team of terrific people who came together to do what needed to be done. And my role was as a spokesperson, but I very hasten to say that there was an amazing team that was unseen, who did incredible work under incredible pressure, in probably the most difficult, campaign that any group of people have tried to take on in Australian political history, I'd say.
Yeah. And looking back now, would have you done anything differently in how you handled it or how you led in that time?
No, I probably wouldn't have. I guess, with hindsight, maybe we could have started, 20 years earlier instead of 10. But unless, we were overwhelmed by massive cultural forces. I don't think we were overwhelmed by the will of the people. I think the people were manipulated by these cultural forces, by a very clever propaganda machine. And here we are, it's 4 years this November since the plebiscite result was announced. And of course, legislation followed in the Parliament in December of 2017. You look at the scenario now, the things that we said would happen have happened. We said that same-sex marriage would result in a diminution of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and it would take away parents' rights to have their children kept free of radical LGBTIQA plus gender fluid sexual ideology in school. And what are we fighting today? We're fighting gender fluid ideology taught in primary schools everywhere. We've just had a freedom of religion or religious discrimination bill introduced into the federal parliament by Scott Morrison. It's being hotly contested because it seeks to try and restore some of the freedoms that were lost as a result of gay marriage. We've got, transgender males competing against females at the Olympic Games and in all of our sport right across the board. The Australian government sports guidelines say that biological blokes have to compete with girls, so it just goes on and on. The consequences of this rainbow political ideology have only their momentum has only accelerated since the passing of same-sex marriage, which is exactly what we thought would happen, and it has happened. In fact, it's happened quicker than I thought.
Yeah. Okay. And where do you feel, or where do you see Christians, churches not really understanding these issues, or maybe not really feeling the effects of them?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in this podcast. I think the church in the last couple of hundred years has retreated to pietism, has traduced the gospel to me and Jesus and me getting to heaven. So it's about how can I get out of earth to heaven instead of how do we fulfill what Jesus asked us to pray for in the Lord's Prayer, that thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. When the disciples said to Jesus, tell us how we should pray, he didn't say pray that you go to heaven. He said pray that you bring heaven to earth. And what we're seeing as a result of our vacation of the public square is hell coming to earth. It's hell when a child is deliberately denied the love of their mother or father because, two blokes decide, they can replace the mother and, rent a womb and, start a market in human babies, which is what the gay lobby now wants, so that two blokes can have, marriage equality. Commercial surrogacy is hell on earth. And it's not just Christians who say that. The radical feminists will say that as well. The killing of the unborn is hell on earth. A little girl wanting to compete in sport but having to compete against a boy, it just goes on. And there's many, many other examples. And this is because we as Christians have been silent. And one of the books that really impacted me strongly in my early days at ACL was Eric Metaxas's biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his famous dictum that silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. And the church has chosen not to speak in the face of evil. And that was my feeling of great grief. And I write about it in the book coming out of the same-sex marriage debate. And I think the church missed a big opportunity. I do believe it was avoidable. And I believe much of the cultural mess that we find ourselves in is avoidable, but the church isn't playing its role as the pillar and ground of truth, as salt and light, as leaven in society. And we need to recapture that role with great urgency.
Yeah, it's a great encouragement. Really appreciate that. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing at the moment with the Christian Democratic Party in New South Wales. Maybe you could tell us the story. You could tell it better than me. But you've been invited down by Fred Nile to succeed him in the Parliament there in New South Wales. Maybe tell us a bit about that. And it's hit a bit of it's stalled. It's hit a little bit of I don't know, maybe it's not little, but it's really stalled. So maybe update everyone a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure, Caleb. Yeah, this has been a real challenge and a difficulty. And I was asked earlier in the year, quite out of the blue. Actually, I wasn't expecting this, wasn't looking for it. I'd been living back in Queensland, seeking a political direction in life, and had pursued that through a couple of avenues. And I got an invitation from Reverend Fred Nile, who's been a Christian politician in the New South Wales Upper House for 40 years. It's been incredible. And I remember reading his autobiography when I was a young man, and it greatly inspired me about how this Christian minister got himself into politics. And he was one of the early campaigners against pornography. Before there was a Me Too movement, Fred Nile was saying we shouldn't abuse young women through sexualizing them through pornography. He was a man ahead of his time. He called out the gay Mardi Gras and its values and how destructive that was to families and still is. So he was a very courageous voice, and was certainly someone who inspired me as a young political activist. And so to be contacted out of the blue by him, by his team, and then my wife and I flew to Sydney in March of this year and met with him, and he said he wanted to retire from the Parliament, and he felt that God had asked him to, or God had told him to ask me to be his replacement, and that was a great honour. So as part of that, a succession plan was developed. His board signed off on it, and in the lead up to a transition which was due to take place this month in November of 2021, I came down ahead of time to start working in his party organisation. And I don't think he'd mind me saying, but the party organisation has certainly declined over the years, and it has some problems which are very public. Unfortunately, there's a bit of factionalism and some court cases. So I knew I was stepping into a difficult situation. But I came in May and immediately started working in the role as Director of Campaigns and Communications ahead of the transition into the Parliament. And I discovered there was a terrific appetite amongst God's people for what the Christian Democratic Party has to offer. Thousands of supporters joined us, hundreds of new members, and we raised $120,000 in a very short period of time. But then, for some reason, and look, there's some things that have been said on the public record. Reverend Nile decided to disendorse me. I've sadly not had a conversation. I've been denied the opportunity to have a conversation with him, to sit down and have and understand that. There's some things on the public record which people can find through Google. So it's been a grief and a disappointment. The party, because of problems that predated my arrival, is in receivership at the moment. So I remain employed by the party in that role. A board election is upcoming, and so my wife and I have just decided that we'll stay and contest the board election. And if the members of the party would like me to participate in a leadership role to help give the party a viable future, well, we'll do that. If not, that's fine. We'll accept what the party members have to say, and we'll look towards whatever else God has in life. But I just have a sense that that God does have a future for the CDP, and so we've decided to hang in. It's been very difficult, been very challenging, but we're still here, and this process still has a few weeks and possibly months to play out because of the Christmas break. So
and what do you think the biggest? I mean, it would be difficult to be objective at the moment. I'm sure you got a lot of skin in the game. You've moved your whole life into state for this role, and it's kind of been somewhat snatched from you at the moment. Must be really difficult. But if you can separate yourself a tiny bit from that, like, what are you learning in this time about leadership, about succession? Succession's a huge part of leadership that's often not done well. Any lessons there?
Yeah, look, obviously this is a terrible succession, and it's gone very, very badly. And look, I don't want to, my heart and desire is to, honour the legacy of Reverend Nile. He's done amazing things, but obviously, things have hit a snag as the organisation he founded is seeking to ensure that it has a future, and I guess there's a big question mark over that future at the moment. I think the things that I'm learning personally is very much patience, and that's not an easy thing. This crisis has and it's been in the public arena, so we can talk about it, and I'm not going to say everything that's gone on behind the scenes, but it's been difficult and challenging, as you've said. But I'm learning patience and learning very much that to really rely on the Lord, not to just look to natural circumstances. you do what you can, but you certainly, realise that we are in a spiritual battle, and the enemy is not people. The enemy is not those who, I think might have done the wrong thing by me or whatever. There is, there's a spiritual dimension to everything that we face in life, and so it's just learning to understand that better and to really pray into that, and then to do what we can. So yeah, patience and endurance is probably the big things.
Right. And you had a succession with in the ACL when you took that over. What was that like with Jim Wallace? You took over from him, who's a phenomenal statesman. For those who don't know, maybe my generation younger may not realise his involvement with the Australian Defence Force and the SAS and incredible leadership there. So I mean, that was big shoes to fill. Well, what worked well in that succession, that transition?
Yeah, that was a real privilege to be involved, with that transition. I went to ACL in 2007, and Jim made it very clear to me right from the start that he was looking for someone to succeed him ultimately. Now that sort of surprised me at the time, because I thought, well, I'm still a relatively young man. Jim certainly wasn't old. And I went there and I worked for him for 5 years. But in the course of that period, he said, look, are you still interested in taking this on? And look, obviously being, youngish and ambitious. And then I said, yes, that would be a privilege. And so we worked through a process over time. It would have been, a couple of years. And it was done with the board. And we, this is where I saw the value and the absolute critical nature of good godly governance in a Christian organisation. And I've seen succession done really badly in churches. Obviously, I'm involved in a really bad one at the moment. But what we went through in 2012, 2013 with ACL, with the guidance of the board, with Jim being clear, with things being written out. Now, I'm not saying it was all easy, and I'm sure Jim would say it's not easy as a man who is a dynamic leader to then hand over to a younger whippersnapper who's not as experienced and makes mistakes, but he gave me room to make mistakes, and he remained as a mentor and a friend. And I think one of the keys for me was I really felt very strongly not to in any way, and I hope I didn't, but really felt that I wasn't to in any way cut Jim off from me personally. I still pursued a proactive mentoring role when I went into the managing director's job, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I know of other contemporaries of mine who said as soon as they transitioned into, particularly in senior pastor roles in churches, they said, the first thing you have to do is get rid of the old guy, make sure. Well, I really felt that was wrong. I invited Jim back to staff retreats all the time, to our fundraising dinners, made sure that he had profile. And I think what made it work is whilst he was always available to give me guidance and advice, he didn't seek to interfere. He didn't try and get involved in the day-to-day management. He took a governance role, not an operational role. And we were clear on the distinctives of that role. So that gave me freedom to operate the organisation, to grow and develop in my leadership, but also to draw on his wisdom and experience. And we remain, great friends to this day, even though I left ACL in early 2018. And of course, Martin Isles succeeded me, and he's been amazing. And again, I think the governance and godly environment that the board of ACL created and creates to this day allowed a function. Two very functional transitions that have in both cases taken the organisation to new levels, and that I think
so
is the
critical
difference between what I'm experiencing at the moment. Very dysfunctional governance, and in fact, almost non-existent governance. So it is really, really important.
It's difficult when there's a lack of health, and it sounds like that's maybe what you're talking about with the CDP. It's a challenge in my world with churches, and essentially, if things are healthy, eventually it may be slow, but fruit will come, the harvest comes, the benefits come down the road.
Yeah.
And health begins with governance. It begins with the council of wisdom that sits at the top of an organisation. And sometimes that isn't the formal board. Sometimes it's in the church world, it can be a group of older people, but someone has power at the top. And if that's healthy, you're going to get this flow on of succession and raising up the next generation and looking to the future and managing transitions. I think if it's unhealthy, you get power grabs. People have way too much emotional engagement. They're getting something out of the organisation that's not right. And I would assume, without knowing, that you're probably bumping into some of these things in the CDP, whether they're visible and evident or whether they're invisible, but there's things that aren't right. There's just a lack of health, and there's not clarity of vision. There's not good communication. Someone's in it for the wrong reasons. So it's great to hear that with Jim, because a man like that, it is very difficult when you've been involved in ACL from the grassroots. You've been a leader all your life. To still be involved but not to overreach shows a lot of character on his behalf.
It shows enormous character, because I still would rate Jim as he's probably the most amazing leader that I've encountered in my life, and I've had the privilege of being exposed to many great leaders. But I think his humility as a very good, functional, secure leader himself, to hand over control and and power with great humility to a younger man who was nowhere near as experienced and did not have the gravitas that he had, but nonetheless did it anyway in a way that then allowed me to develop my leadership. And I hope, and I tried, and I'm sure I did it very imperfectly, but to try and show humility from my end, in that I wasn't there to try and cut him off or to marginalise him in any way. And I remember clear as day another leader in the body of Christ saying to me, if Jim Wallace stays on your board when you're managing director, you'll never be managing. Well, that was it was well intentioned, but it wasn't the truth. And we were able to get the best of both worlds, in terms of me being able to flourish and develop, and also there being a proper role of honour for the organisation's founder. But he was secure enough to know where the demarcation lines are, and we were able to operate that. And
which
now,
it all comes back to. It all comes back
absolutely.
to that, doesn't it, Lyle? Like, you have to be secure in yourself. When there's a lack
Very
of security in yourself, then that's where problems start.
Yeah, and look, I'd be the first to say, growing into security is something that I had to learn, and I'm not saying everything was perfect, but we did manage to execute it in a way that produced beautiful fruit. And the organisation went to another level, and then when Martin took over from me, it went to another level again, because of the incredible giftedness he had. But I believe his incredible gifts were able to be released in the context of a godly and a functional and secure board. And so the governance is so crucial.
Crucial. I've seen it a lot myself. Well, I've really loved having you on, Lyle. It's been amazing. We've covered a whole bunch of different things, from how you handle difficult people on the internet, your book, culture wars, same-sex marriage, the CDP, which for those listening is in New South Wales. We're not talking federally here. We're talking New South Wales Parliament. Is there anything you'd like to say, mate, as we finish off?
No, it's just been a great privilege, Caleb, to be able to express these views. I hope I haven't rambled and ranted too much, but it's been an enormous privilege, and I appreciate the insightful way you've asked questions. So thank you, and
thanks, mate.
I hope this is a blessing.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. You're a great leader. I think it's been great to kind of watch your career and involvement in politics. I love your heart for God and the fact that you want to use what you believe in to bless other people in Australia and in the culture and through the political area especially. So, yeah, well done, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Caleb.
I trust you were impacted by that Leadership Lessons podcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about today's podcast. Please comment down below, and please review the podcast and share it with a friend. Doing this inspires us and helps others to find the podcast. See you next time.